yeah, super stoked that we finally delved into some Hedges for the first time, probably not the last time in the history of the Vanguard Book Club that we'll read some Hedges. But yeah, I guess we can go ahead and dive in as we do. For people who are new to the formatting, we usually take one or two chapters a week, break them down in the book. We take a couple of quotes that we like, things that we think are going to be good conversation starters. So yeah, we're down to the final two chapters of the book. We're going to be talking a lot about whistleblowing, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, a few others that you may not be as familiar with. So good time with that as the Assange case continues to unfold. It's looking more and more likely, unfortunately, that the British court system is going to extradite him to America. So we'll talk about all of that and more. But yeah, I guess unless you had anything else that you wanted to kick off the show with before the quotes, we'll get started.
Well, I just wanted to remind everyone that obviously we're doing Wages of Rebellion by Chris Hedges, which is, of course, Chris Hedges' examination of and insights, musings into revolution and revolt across the country, across time. He's examining a lot of different, revolutionary people, revolutionary groups and ideas, and the success and unsuccessful attempts towards rebellion against various oppressive establishments. So I'm really, I found so much value in this book. Like everything Chris Hedges writes, it's just so well articulated. It's so undeniable and, in its clarity and moral clarity. So yeah, really enjoyed this book. Really glad we read it. And I would urge you guys to do the same. If you weren't reading along with us, definitely not too late to crack it open. It's really worth the read.
Yeah. And it's a short little book, guys. Like a lot of times you read about theory or you read about stuff like this and you got to read like 1,000-page tome. Okay. This book is like 200 and, some odd 20 pages, I think. 226 pages, super engaging, super easy to read. If you take it a chapter at a time, it almost feels like reading the Hedges article off the fucking internet. Really good way to break it down like that. And also when you read Hedges, one more thing before we get into it, you understand how well read this man is. This man has consumed more text. Like I consider myself a reader, right? I like to read. I get enjoyment from it. I can't even sniff the number of books that this guy has put away, like classics, stuff that was written thousands of years ago, stuff that he's digested, understanding the Roman empires, all these kinds of things. Like people, you wonder how a guy like this is so informed, how he's so prescient, how he's so able to use his foresight effectively. I really think a lot of it does come back to the fact that he's so well studied, that he's such an ardent reader, and that is just one of the first things that will stand out to anybody that reads his work, is the fact that this guy knows his way around a fucking library. Let me tell you that.
Yeah, that's so accurate. It's incredibly impressive how well read Chris Hedges is. And also, I think something that brings just an immense amount of insight to his work that can't be understated is his actual real life person-to-person experience with so many of the subjects of his writing. He talks a lot about the prison industrial complex, for example, in this book. And of course, a lot of us know about the horrific conditions in prisons, but Chris Hedges has spent a lot of his life teaching in prisons. He is intimately familiar with not just the conditions in a prison, but the prisoners themselves, the day-to-day struggles, which they go through. And even a lot of the political prisoners, high profile political prisoners, which he writes about in this book, he actually recounts his own experiences talking to them, interviewing them in prison, in person. So it brings a level of insight that's really undeniable. And again, it's one thing for us to sit here and talk about how atrocious the conditions are in X, Y, and Z place or conditions wherever. But a lot of these situations, Chris Hedges is intimately familiar with the actual conditions, having been there himself, having studied these situations on the ground. So it just really does bring a level of insight that I think is almost unmatched and really makes this read and all of his books worth the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we can just fucking dive right in with our first quote. We've got about a dozen of them or so. So speaking of the depth of actual lived experience that Hedges has, he says, in every place I covered as a war correspondent, the press of the nation at war was an enthusiastic part of the machine, cheerleaders for slaughter and tireless myth makers for the nation and military. The few renegades within the press who refuse to wave the white flag and lionize the troops become pariahs in newsrooms and find themselves attacked, like Assange and Manning, by the state. Obviously, with the current political situation that we find ourselves in, Julian Assange is on the forefront of all of our minds with his extradition case. He's still languishing in Belmarsh prison, even though he should have gone free during the time period, at least during the appeals position, but they've still kept him under these draconian, cruel, torturous conditions, and it's to send a message, right? Do not do these kinds of things. Do not get out of line. The media, the powers that be, whatever you want to fucking call them, they are big fans of the carrot and stick approach. They will loud you and give you all of the accolades that you could possibly want, as long as you're willing to toe the fucking line that they're willing to tell you. I was listening to Chris Hedges talk on Contact a while ago, and he was talking about how the fastest thing you learn as a journalist is that if you just are going to shine the shoes of power, you're going to ride up the elevator real quickly, and the second you challenge power, you're going to get the fucking your bags packed. So I just thought this was a great way to kick it off, and also to kind of understand the fact that the media, and obviously if you're listening to the Vanguard, you're relatively well acquainted with critique of the media, but the media is just as big of a part of the war machine of this industrial military complex. It's a firm component, because it's like, what's that William Randolph Hearst quote? He was like, you give me the paper, I'll give you the war, or something like. I can't remember the fucking quote that he has about how the newspapers sell the war, basically.
Yeah, so this is definitely a great quote, and of course it automatically brings to mind for me Chris Hedges himself, the author of this text and of this paragraph. He's someone who, of course, was never a cheerleader for the war machine, and has definitely been a renegade within the press who refuses to wave the white flag and lionize the troops. And he's found himself a pariah, exactly as he describes here. Despite being a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, just has insurmountable, incomparable experience and insight on the ground. It's crazy that he doesn't have a bigger voice. He's not featured on more mainstream media websites. It would be any number of sites. It should be their honor to platform Chris Hedges, but instead you have to go to like SheerPost or more undiscovered kind of indie media platforms to find his work a lot of the times, which is cool because he's staying true to his values. But it's also unfortunate because I feel like a lot of people miss out on his thinking. So I think this is obvious in a lot of ways, not just in press, but if you think about, especially after 9/11, the amount of people that were essentially ostracized by society. It's like the classic example of the Dixie Chicks, for daring to criticize our involvement in the war. This really proved just how far-reaching and insidious the establishment was, because even pop stars, musical celebrities were affected by this. It wasn't just the reporters and the more traditional and obvious arms of the establishment that were being censored and ostracized like this.
Yeah, exactly. And no better place was that evidence in the same way that it happened to Chris Hedges was in the wake of the Iraq war, and also you have figures like Hedges, run out from the New York Times after the invasion of Iraq. He was their Middle East bureau chief, a fluent Arabic speaker, somebody who had covered conflict in the region for so long. And he was the one that was saying, like, I'm not going to fucking write that this is a good idea. I'm not going to write that this has any root in reality. I'm not going to publish any of that shit. And I will say, I, as the, bureau chief of the Middle East for the New York Times, and calling all this horseshit. Well, we can't have the bureau chief for the New York Times in the Middle East telling the public the truth. So they got to get him the fuck out of there. And also, I apologize to everybody. I fucked up that Hearst quote. It's, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. And I believe he was talking about a war with Cuba in the late 1890s. So, or Spain, in Cuba over that. So anyway, moving on, though, we have some more quotes to cover. And yeah, and this was just kind of like a tack onto the other one. It says, there is no free press without a willingness to defy law and expose the abuses and lies carried out by the powerful. Of course, this is true. Of course, it's fresh on everyone's mind because of Assange, but also because of the likes of Daniel Hale, who was just recently sentenced to almost 4 fucking years behind bars, guys. And a lot of times we get so fucked up because you read all these horrible texts and you're, years like 20 years, 40 years, 60 years around. Any amount of time behind bars for any human being is wrong. And you want to say, oh, they're fucking criminals. No, those people deserve treatment. Nobody deserves to be treated like a fucking animal. I don't care if you've acted like an animal in your real life. We have to treat people with humanity. And you're about to send these heroes, these people who have done this exact, exemplified this exact free press ethos, that are going to spend years of their life fucking.
And even regardless of the amount of time he's actually going to spend in prison, we've already seen how the effects of just being entangled in the justice system, quote unquote, has affected Daniel Hale's life. I remember that report about how he couldn't even hold down a job as a dishwasher before he was actually sentenced, because he had this charge on his record now.
I'm unmuted. The sentencing of the Chelsea Manning marked the day when the state formally declared that all who name and expose its crime will become political prisoners or will be forced, like Snowden, to flee into exile. And this is exactly what the fuck has happened in the United States, right? So first, you have the wave of freedom of those people, a free press, of the people who are going to speak truth to power regardless. You have them basically excised from the media space, right? You otherize them, you make them outcasts of the traditional system, you malign them, denigrate their credibility, whatever the fuck you do. And that opens the door. Now, all of those voices like Chris Hedges, who would have been in a, traditional arm of power. Now those voices aren't there at all. And once those voices aren't there at all making a noise, then you find a target like Julian Assange, you make him odious, you make him, vilified in the media like they've done. So even people who initially would have cheerleaded Julian Assange in the work of WikiLeaks, they slandered him with, the two biggest ways to get fucking liberals to turn their back on you, right? Which is they'll mention something about Hillary Clinton's emails, or there's this like bogus sexual assault charge that so many people have looked into that even the Swedish government wouldn't bring the charges to trial, right? So all of these things that were to make him like a pariah in the fucking eyes of the people, and you have nobody there at all with at the table of what we would call powerful media, right? People that reach the average Joes that aren't already awoken to this kind of horseshit. There's just nobody there that's making the case for Assange at all, and that's how the government can go in and just trample out any of our remaining rights, because the only people there to write from a platform with a big audience have already drinking the Kool-Aid. They already don't give a shit. They're already pro corporate censorship. They're already like, okay, I'll say whatever the fuck you want. Just give me a penthouse in New York City.
Yeah, totally. And that's absolutely accurate. And I think that they've had even more success demonizing Assange to the public than Edward Snowden for a couple of complex reasons. But it has been pointed out that, Edward Snowden was a little bit more traditional in some senses. Obviously he's American to begin with. He was in the military, and a lot of people, painted what he did as an act of patriotism, which obviously it absolutely was. But, that was a little bit more of a digestible narrative for the American public than this Assange guy, who's, again, a foreign, entity who's, not exactly as clean cut and good looking necessarily. The media is trying to paint him in all of these ways, and overall they've been unfortunately quite successful in painting him in this kind of deleterious light. If you even look at characters like AOC, they've been successfully persuaded by establishment media narratives that he's not worth advocating for, not worth associating with. He's weird, he's problematic, all of these kind of notions that have been cooked up again by these media narratives that have unfortunately successfully taken root in many people's mind. And of course, all of that is completely regardless to the actual charges which he's being persecuted for, and the actual precedents this would set where he'd be extradited and charged. So it's really unfortunate to see people that pretend to be progressive and pretend to care, drop the act when it becomes mildly convenient. Again, trying to cast this guy as a problematic character that shouldn't be associated with is unfortunately a very effective tactic, often wielded against the left by the establishment, and this is definitely a prime example of it.
Yeah, and speaking of AOC, I think it also has to be said that Bernie Sanders has not come out strong enough at all for Julian Assange. And actually, we can play a clip here where you see Jeremy Corbyn outside of Belmarsh prison advocating ferociously, just reaching out to Boris Johnson saying, hey, you made your profession, because I didn't know this actually until I watched this clip. Boris Johnson apparently made his profession as a journalist. And so, Jeremy Corbyn is like, please, Boris Johnson, you must have to, anyway, we can watch, we'll cut it in here. But anyway, the fact that Bernie Sanders is not out there doing shit like that is a problem. And it says a lot about what's happened to Bernie Sanders. And obviously, Gavin and I give credit to Bernie when it's due. Obviously, he's responsible for where this movement's at in a large way because of his mammoth run in 2016 and again in 2020. That being said, he knows better. He should be speaking out against Julian, or in favor of Julian Assange, against the extradition of Assange and for free press. He won't do it because he's scared of liberal backlash, and I think that's pretty pathetic. Manning was also barred from presenting to the court her motives for giving WikiLeaks hundreds of thousands of classified diplomatic cables, war logs from Afghanistan and Iraq, and videos. The issues of her motives and the potential harm to national security could be raised only at the time of sentencing, but by then it was too late. And this is exactly what we've seen with Daniel Hale. It's what we saw with Reality Winner. It's what we will see if they ever successfully get Edward Snowden back to America, which I don't think they will. They will not let you basically use any, the way that they've constructed the legal system surrounding whistleblowers is everything is classified, right? So you can't show any of it to the jury. You can't talk about any of it to the jury. You can't even discuss what you've leaked because that's all still classified. And even though the public already knows about it, you can't talk about it in your own trial. It's a circus, right? It's a show trial when you do these things because it's your guilt is already determined, and the United States has basically taken away all of your legal rights and all of your authority and power as a defendant that you would have, even in the limited justice that we have in our so-called justice system, which, we've talked about a million ways to Sunday is broken as shit. But even then you have some rights, right? They'll take all of that shit away and they'll basically find a way to convict you because the judge doesn't give a shit and it's not a jury trial.
Yeah, absolutely. It's total insanity when you really start to look into some of these cases. And I think that these final couple chapters of Wages of Rebellion, Chris Hedges presents just innumerable examples of damning, stories of how political prisoners in America are treated, how there's an utter disregard for the Nuremberg trials, standards, for example, which would have definitely exonerated Chelsea Manning for what she so bravely exposed. But instead, we get these kangaroo courts over and over again, where it's a sealed verdict. Essentially, there's not even really a jury. It's just like, a sentencing carried down from a judge that's obviously, cozied up to the powers that be. And it's that simple. There is no justice system as long as this is going on. There is no habeas corpus for so many of the people being tried. And of course, Assange himself isn't even an American citizen. So that should, obviously present reasons why that should not be going forward, his prosecution, etc. And also what's just so concerning is seeing these other foreign governments play right into the hand of American empire, have no resistance or protesting to these kind of actions. So overall, it's definitely a depressing state of affairs and really a revealing look into, how unjust our quote unquote justice system is.
Yeah, exactly. You hit that right on the money. And the next quote I had literally said, these restrictions prevented Manning from appealing to the Nuremberg Principles, a set of guidelines created by the International Law Commission of the United States after World War II to determine what constitutes a war crime. The Nuremberg Principles are designed to protect those like Manning who expose these crimes because, according to the Nuremberg Principles, following orders is not justification for committing a war crime, right? That's everybody's seen A Few Good Men. It was like, did you give the order? I did what I had to do. Did you give the order? You're damn right I did. But then they still convict the fucking two Marines that were just the ones that, got ordered to do it. And the guy's like, we didn't protect the little man. We didn't signify or whatever the fuck he doesn't say. But anyway, yes. That is all true. And this is just another example of why the United States is completely, or another reason of how the United States has completely done away with international law. They completely operate above the board. They don't, they will gladly point fingers at any other country that's violating international law, like Russia. They'll be like, you're violating international law in Crimea. And it's like, great, you're giving a shit ton of money to Israel. Like, let's play this game. And that's what they all say. But anyway, we have no ground to stand on in America, obviously. But this is just another revealing element of how they've stripped our fucking rights away.
Yeah, it's so damning when you really find out the extent to which the United States operates on its own, completely disregards international law at every available opportunity. And of course, I think this is a good chance to remind everyone of Noam Chomsky's famous quote about how every U.S. president post World War II would be hung if the Nuremberg, standards still applied, which of course they should be. I think those are pretty reasonable standards. If you look at the kind of crimes that were prosecuted in the Nuremberg trials, I think we can all agree that that was a necessity, right? So maybe those standards should apply. That precedent should still exist today to prevent further horrors and, war crimes from occurring. These atrocities that we, pretend will never again, when it comes to war crimes.
Like when we bombed the shit out of Somalia like a couple days ago.
Yeah, exactly. And then this kind of stuff happens based on a declaration to fight terrorism from the early 2000s, which in and of itself was unjust and phony. So, it's absolute insanity. And the more you start to think about it, it really just reveals the nature of this country and our empire and what our actions abroad, really speak to.
Yeah. And, I pulled this other quote, this next one, because I thought it was so, well well said, right? Hedges writes that the Afghans, the Iraqis, the Yemenis, the Pakistanis, and the Somalis know what American military forces do. They do not need to read WikiLeaks. It is we who remain ignorant. Those people experience the fucking deluge of bombings. They experience the wrath of sanction, watching their children starve, go without medicine. Watching bodies blown up in front of you. This is the kind of trauma that we daily inflict on on fellow human beings on another fucking part of the world, right? And it's so fucked up that the liberals are so into oh, we need to make sure that everybody at the workspace is having a great fucking life and nobody's stressed and all these fucking things. And it's like, obviously that's how a shallow, cover for capitalism as well. As soon as you're no longer productive to them, they don't give a shit about anything either. But just the shallowness and the lack of fucking self-awareness that every American has, including Gavin and I, about this fucking shit, right? We don't reckon with this reality on a day-to-day basis because it would destroy every single one of us that has a soul and has any amount of empathy and humanity left within us, because that is the kind of barbarism that is at play constantly and perpetuated by the American empire. We're the only ones that are ignorant of that. The people that are our victims, the victims of this machine that we call America, those people don't need to learn shit from WikiLeaks. And I just thought that was a really powerful thing to mention, because it's so true. And it's one of those things that because of our privilege, because of our perspectives, we don't really consider.
Yeah, and not only that, I think also Chris Hedges points out really eloquently in this chapter that, when it comes to terrorism, or what we think of terrorism, people in the West, people from America, are so insulated from the actual conditions on the ground there that they don't even understand the kind of radicalization that occurs when American foreign policy takes place in such a devastating fashion. Of course, that's going to, foster a climate of desperate people that are eager for revenge, that are seeking vengeance because they feel so, destroyed in their lives. So everything has been taken from them. I mean, what else is there to live for other than to try to strike back at what took everything from you to begin with? And of course, that's not to justify any sort of violent action whatsoever, but it's important context that is completely left out of the narrative when it comes to the way the media talks about this stuff. It's just portrayed as these crazy Islamic radicals that are sitting over here stewing about ways that they can destroy America and take down the West, and these crazed, insane radical people. Well, why are they radical? Why have they been radicalized? What has been taken from them that makes them feel this intense need to destroy and, get revenge? And again, that's not to justify it, but it is context that's important to understand what's going on here and how to prevent it. Because obviously the way to prevent that is to get the fuck out of the region anyway. Stop destroying things. Stop, totally dislocating any sort of order or tradition that previously existed in these communities and cultures.
Yeah, 100%. And to go on, that feeds, we talk about how we're perpetuating all of these things, these massive crimes, these mammoth injustices that happen daily, right? And Chris Hedges asks a fair question. He says, why should we respect a court system or a government system that does not respect us and doesn't respect the humanity of anyone else, right? He says, why should we abide by laws that protect only criminals like Wall Street thieves while leaving the rest of us exposed to abuse? Why should we continue to have faith in structures of power that deny us our most basic rights and civil liberties? Why should we be impoverished so that the profits of big banks, corporations, and hedge funds can swell? And I think it's also important to say that on top of that, that's what's happening to us domestically. What's happening overseas is what we were just talking about. So, how can you respect a system that does all of those things? You can't in good faith, right? And that's why the United States and the people are rejecting it because it's corporate rule. It is not justice.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, this kind of, repeated happenings leads to this, intense anti-establishment mindset in the public, which of course can be weaponized for good, but also can be kind of capitalized on by an authoritarian type character like Donald Trump, who, realized that there was this level of dissatisfaction and distrust in our establishments, but unfortunately did not use that for good. He used that to get himself elected, to further enrich himself and his family, et cetera, et cetera. So, this is exactly what's going to happen when the institutions continually fail us over and over again as a society, and continually let the most vulnerable among us, be even more exposed. So, this is something that needs to be reckoned with. And of course, we can't blame people for not trusting these institutions. They have failed them over and over and over again. So it's just something that needs to be understood when we think about American politics at this point, people's desperation and lack of trust in the institutions, their hatred of the elites, etc. These people have failed them over and over again. These people have been failed.
Absolutely, and that's why we've seen a massive. I mean, America's always had a poor role, a poor turnout when it comes to like elections, right? Because people aren't stupid and they know how little it fucking matters to do that shit. It matters, but it just matters little compared to like how much it should, right? The United States entire system of government that we call federalism is literally set up, as Noam Chomsky again loves to point out to everybody, to protect the interests of the or to protect the minority of the opulence from the ignorant majority. I believe it's a quote from James Madison. So anyway, that's one of the fuckers that wrote the Federalist Papers. So in case you're curious, you can check that shit out. It exists. It's real. But anyway, he goes on to say that the world has been turned upside down. The pestilence of corporate totalitarianism is spreading over the earth. The criminals have seized power. It is not only Assange, Hammond, Abu Jamal, Manning, and Hashmi they want, which are all political prisoners in the United States. You might not be familiar with Hammond. He's a hacker, and obviously you guys probably are familiar with everybody else. But anyway, it is all who dared to defy the destructive fury of the global corporate state. The persecution of these rebels is the harbinger of what is to come. The rise of a bitter world where criminals in tailored suits and gangsters in beribboned military uniforms, propped up by a vast internal and external security apparatus, a compliant press, and a morally bankrupt political elite, hunt down and cage all who resist. Holy shit, that sounds like reality, and it also sounds super fucked up like a horror film. But that's exactly where we're at. And we forget about this because so many of us can, fucking pacify ourselves or fucking, medicate ourselves however we can to forget about these cruel fucking realities. And that's fine for the most part, because as we've pointed out half a dozen times, you can't sit and think about this shit all the fucking time. You'll go crazy. You're not going to be a productive member of the opposition, of the resistance, if you fucking go crazy. But it's got to be put in the front of our mind on purpose, at least every day, to remind ourselves what we're up against, what people like Mumia Abu Jamal have been suffering through for the past decades as they've been political prisoners in America, what people like Julian Assange have been suffering through while they've been an American political prisoner overseas for almost a decade. So or if not over a decade. I'm not sure when Assange went to the embassy. I think it was early 2010s. But anyway, this is all something that we have to reckon with, because the criminals have taken over. They have all of the fucking power. The war criminals, the Wall Street criminals, those people have all of the chips, and we have to figure out a way to get them back.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just totally crazy and heartbreaking, considering that, all of these prisoners are people that have literally done something that is heroic and patriotic of the highest order. It's not like these people did anything other than expose what absolutely should have been exposed. And as we've mentioned a couple times in this episode, it's not just that, the empire wants to treat them poorly just for the sake of doing so. It's to set an example. It's to prevent more people from getting any ideas. And that's just absolutely the most chilling effect of this kind of prosecution.
Yeah, and one of the points that I've been trying to make, and Gavin, I know you have too, is that, one that Chris Hedges makes here as well, and it's about the fact that this battle, it is not just going to be the woke people on the coasts that are fighting this fight, right? That's just, we need big tent politics. We need a big movement, and we need middle America to join our fight if we're going to make this happen. And he says, the battle with the corporate state will take place not only in city streets and plazas, but in the nation's heartland. Ranchers, farmers, and enraged citizens, often after seeing their land seized by an eminent domain and their water supplies placed under mortal threat, have united with activists to oppose fracking and the building of the Keystone XL tar sand pipeline. So this book is a little old. We all remember the fucking Keystone battles, I'm sure. But that is true, right? That was one of the first ways where this became less about abstract, like leftist coastalism, and became something where people were traveling from cities like Chicago, New York, LA, and going into America's heartland to stand with people who had been working this land for generations. It should also be noted that a lot of indigenous people were out there sacrificing their bodies and their land in order to defend the earth from the Keystone tar sand pipeline. But yeah, Gavin, did you have anything to add about that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me kind of the populist movement of the farmers in Kansas, that Thomas Frank writes about, and how, yeah, absolutely. If there actually is going to be a serious kind of rebellion against these corporate forces, against these establishment forces, of course we're going to have to join arms with our farmers and rural neighbors, etc. I mean, that's a massive portion of this country. These people might not be as evolved in every way as some of the coastal elites like to think that they are, the people that live in big cities and urban areas. But I mean, these are American citizens too, and we have to, reckon with that fact. If we ever are going to be successful in our revolution and our revolt, of course, we're going to need to foster a solidarity with all of our neighbors and all of our citizens, and hopefully, we can all evolve together as a people.
I think that's 100% spot on, and it's one of the reasons why Gavin and I are proud to be Midwesterners, right? Anarcho Midwesterners, corn commies over here holding it down. The Green New Deal needs to be sold to farmers. All the land seizures, the fact that corporate tyranny could be much better explained to people in the heartland by talking about big agriculture and the fact that they've all been fucked and they're massively in debt because they can't actually make money off of the harvest anymore. Even with the government subsidies that are in place, all this kind of stuff. That's where you can fucking reach people. These people aren't goners, man. They're just desperate, and you got to give people a fucking something when you're desperate. And the thing is that the Republicans always offer people something in the heartland, right? It's like racism and faux populism and anti-abortion rhetoric and like that phony Christianity shit. But the people in the coastal liberal circles, they offer those people nothing except insults and fucking derision. Yeah, I don't know why I couldn't get that word out for a second, but anyway, thanks, Gavin. Yeah, and anyway, I'll just plow into this quote because I think it's true, right? He says he has the quote about the sublime madness. Reinhold Niebuhr wrote that those who defy the forces of injustice and repression are possessed by sublime madness in the soul, which disregards immediate appearances and emphasizes profound and ultimate unities. Niebuhr noted that nothing but madness will do battle with malignant power and spiritual wickedness in high places. The sublime madness, as Niebuhr understood, is dangerous, but it's vital. And I think that that's true. The sublime madness that we've been talking about throughout all of this book. The delusions of the rebel, right? The rebellious. Like, you have to understand firmly the reality of the situation and the odds that you're up against, because, as Chris Hedges has noted many times, he doesn't share the quote mania for hope that is peddled to people in the modern day. We have to be firm in our reality. And then he always goes back to that Sartre quote about, you don't fight fascism to win, you fight fascism because it's fascist, right? I don't know. I just think that that's important that we all understand that we're up against what seems like an impossible mission, and that's because the odds are really fucking slim. Let's not deny ourselves that reality. Let's live in it. But on the other hand, it's like we have a moral obligation and a spiritual necessity of continuing this fight and moving the ball forward in whatever capacity we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really exemplified by, of course, the brave actions of the whistleblowers we've been talking about a lot, like Chelsea Manning, like Julian Assange, etc. Assange famously said, lies start wars, only the truth can stop them. And even though the wars haven't stopped, even though we're still involved in a lot of these endless conflicts, they're that much closer to stopping as a result of what's been exposed by the likes of Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, Daniel Hale, etc. And we have a right, we must know the truth about what's going on, even if it doesn't directly lead to the end of this war. At least that education is out there. More people are going to be less susceptible to the propaganda now that they've seen the collateral murder video, for example. It's a lot harder to just go along with the empire's propaganda when you've seen with your own eyes the murderous actions of it. It's a lot harder to just let yourself be lulled into this trance of empire propaganda when these images and videos have literally been shown to you. It's just that much. It makes it that much harder for the empire to maintain this ruse on its taxpayers.
Yeah, exactly. And Hedges writes, the rebel, by disseminating the truth, forces us to embrace a new radicalism. The rebel shows that there is no hope for correction or reversal by appealing to power. The rebel makes it clear that it is only by overthrowing traditional systems of power that we can be liberated. And I think that that's fair. And a lot of people might say, oh, well, you guys always say like, oh, it's, fair to work within the systems of power, to mitigate harm. And I'll stand by that decision and say that, because of the position or because of the where we find ourselves, of course, it makes sense to, tacitly participate in, things like electoral politics. And like, yes, Gavin and I were bummed when Nina Turner lost, because on the margins, that will make a small difference in people's lives, perhaps. And so I would support that. However, neither of us harbor any delusions that that's going to ever solve the crises that we face. So I think that, that I support a bifurcation of those types of deals. I think that you can understand clearly that the system will never eradicate the need, that it will never meet the moment. That being said, I think harm reduction is a very real thing. And as a comrade to the people around me, if I think that we can, use the system to alleviate their immediate suffering as we figure out our long-term game plan, then I think that that's worthwhile. I know a couple of people on our last comment commented like, hey, how do you guys get behind all of this radical revolutionary Hedges and then still, support candidates or the squad in some capacity? And so I just wanted to respond to that and say that I think you can do both things and understand both things.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And also, overthrowing traditional systems of power doesn't have to mean a full-on, straight-up revolution, everything burned to the ground. You can overthrow traditional systems of power in a kind of a micro way at certain points. I mean, even what we're doing with our show, I think, contributes to the overthrowing the traditional system of media power. Giving a voice to people with independent ideas that are speaking truth to power, that are unafraid to buck the traditional narratives being proffered by the mainstream press. I mean, that in and of itself isn't, a somewhat revolutionary act of overthrowing the traditional system of media power. There's a lot of institutions and establishments which kind of dictate our ways of life in this country, via capitalism, or how that manifests across the different sectors of the economy. There are acts of rebellion we can all engage in that may not be everything, but it's certainly something.
Right, and that's just a way of keeping the fucking people going, right? It gets to a point, right? I know I've been talking about Grapes of Wrath a little bit because I just read it. It gets to the point where people are so fucking defeated that they just won't go on anymore. So I think that harm they don't even care. They can't care anymore. They're so pushed to the brink, right? All they care about is getting food, getting shelter, taking care of their immediate families, all these kinds of things. And that's how the forces that pit us against each other, right? It's why I'm not an accelerationist. Like a lot of things, it's too fucking good for people to fucking revolt right now. We need to fucking starve everyone. No, I don't think that. And as a result of my not thinking that, I think, okay, well, let's feed everybody, let's educate everybody with the opportunities that we have. If we can keep people in their home for 60 days, it's a win, in the sense that they're not homeless tonight. We have 60 more days to fight. So it's taking everything by a battle instead of looking at it as one fight is the war, in my view. But anyway, the next quote that I had from Hedges that I wanted to read was the fact that he says, history has vindicated resistance groups such as the White Rose and plotters such as von den Busch. Those were two individuals that resisted Hitler in Hitler's Germany. But they were desperately alone when they defied the law, their oaths of allegiance and public opinion. Von den Busch said that even after the war, he was spat at as he walked down city streets in Germany. Rebellion, when it begins, is not legal, safe, comfortable, or popular. And I think that that's another thing to remember, right? A lot of times you just, the ideas when they start, you're going to be derided by a lot of people. You see that now, obviously, as your ideas are as your movement grows, you start to see that change. As you say, history will vindicate you, but you can't be looking for vindication as you're espousing your ideas, as you're pushing people forward at the time, right? That the work hasn't been done yet. The work that you're doing by changing people's minds, hearts, whatever, through your words, is that building your movement. I don't know, maybe I'm on a hill here and that's not making sense.
No, I understand what you're saying, and I think that something that really exemplifies this lately is the eco-environmentalist movements. I think that they've really been vindicated a lot recently as everyone starts to come to terms with the realities of climate change. I mean, if you think about 10, 20, 30 years ago, if you heard about some act of eco-terrorism, quote unquote, someone tying themselves to a tree, or Greenpeace trying to, disrupt mining or oil extraction, et cetera, the destruction of environments, ecocide, people would have called those people crazy. Oh, they're just getting in the way of industry. This needs to happen. Everyone needs paper, everyone needs energy, etc. But I think those people have been vindicated now. We now see that they were on a very righteous mission, that they were literally the only thing standing between the total destruction of our environment and our planet, and the profits of these giant corporations and rapacious, pieces of shit that have profited off of the destruction of our environment, planet, and animal species, etc. So, I think just like these, resistance group to the Nazis, just like they were vindicated, I think a lot of the environmentalist activist movements will absolutely be vindicated. And if there is any future to this country, that they'll absolutely be looked back upon as heroes, in the sense that they never were during their lifetimes.
Yeah, and I think that the environmental movement is a perfect example of something that will change over time. But also something that we should be weary of is the fact that as we continue to exist in a meaningful way, and as it grows more and more popular to do things like sabotage fracking facilities, or halt pipelines or whatever, the penalties that are imposed on individuals, and that's something that Hedges points out in this book, are going to be extremely draconian, right? He talks about a guy that's got more combined time for his American crime of sabotaging a pipeline than the 3 other conspirators who were Canadian got combined in Canada. Because America will put profit above fucking anything. So if you start,
that's why they literally classify it as terrorism, even though it's just activism. Even if you're literally just like tying yourself to a tree and you're not harming anyone, you're just harming, quote unquote, the profits of the corporation. That is literally considered terrorism, and you will be tried as a terrorist, which of course means that you don't really have habeas corpus, which means most of your rights go out the window automatically. So yeah, it's already extraordinarily draconian for people that are protesting not just the destruction of the environment, but animal agriculture, the horrific conditions of factory farms, the people that try to film these conditions and expose it to the world. These people are often also tried as terrorists, which is absolute insanity, given that they're just exposing what so many people don't even realize that they're consuming, supporting.
Yeah, and there's actually this guy I wanted to talk about briefly, Weibo Ludwig. Well, I didn't pull a quote on him, but he's a guy from Alberta who was just living in the wilderness, and he just got struck up by a rage with the fact that they were building Keystone pipelines. And so let me just read this from the book. It says, Ludwig, whose intimate knowledge of the Alberta terrain allowed him to outfox hundreds of police officers, was never caught in an act of sabotage, but he probably had a hand in damaging hundreds of remote well sites, estimated to cost $12 million. The federal government in Ottawa, in desperation, considered sending the army to arrest him. Ludwig was finally arrested in 2000 on 5 counts of property damage and possession of explosive, and imprisoned for 19 months. He spent his entire time in prison reading a treatise in Dutch, of which he was fluent on the nature of hell. So I just thought that was a really interesting side note and a real one out there. Weibo Ludwig, I'm sorry you had to go to jail, but you did some great shit. Wanted to shout you out. And he apparently referred to the spirituality of his cause when he was sentenced, quoting Sun Tzu, saying the war is won before it's fought, saying that the people who are defending the earth have already won a moral victory. The rest is just fighting, which I thought was an interesting perspective as well. I think more quote before we go ahead and wrap up our fucking book. So yeah, this is one of the things that I was talking about earlier, a very Chris Hedges point, something that he repeats often, but I think with good reason. He says, optimism, especially the naive optimism fed to us by the corporate state, engenders self-delusion and passivity, and is the opposite of hope. Rebels who are self-aware, who are obsessed of sublime madness, are also often plagued by gnawing despair. And that's because that's what I was telling you guys. The more you open yourself up to understanding the reality of this world, the horror, the destruction, the chaos, the despair, that shit's gonna eat at you. And so, it's good to have friends, and it's good to have people you love and to go out and do good things. But it's also important to let that shit eat at you, because it reminds you what we're doing this for. And it reminds you of the urgency that's out there, because even if you yourself, we're all comfortable compared to the Yemeni, right? We're all comfortable compared to those that are withstanding airstrikes in Somalia. You know what I mean? So we have to reckon with what we're doing here, what our taxpayers are doing here. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as citizens of this country, that's, extra important that we're aware of that, and our insane privilege that we don't just get from being American citizens, but also from all of these, products we consume, all of these conveniences we take for granted, but often which are built not just on the, blood, sweat, and labor of, our fellow underclass citizens that, slave away for giant corporations for their profit, but also, of course, around the world, all of the people which suffer at the hands of the consumerism and capitalism, which defines America, to be frank. All of these conveniences, like I said, that we take for granted, the ability to just, drive down the street at any hour of the night and get, Taco Bell tomatoes, which were picked by slaves, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. The clothes we wear that are sewn in sweatshops, et cetera. It's absolutely insane. And like you said, it can be easy to get bogged down and just totally defeated by it all. But I don't think that's the correct approach. I think the correct approach is just to educate yourself, be aware, and to the extent that you can, try to make choices to mitigate that, support the, things that are better than others. But at the end of the day, yeah, education is paramount, and, fostering that culture and solidarity so that everyone is also aware of these injustices, because ultimately, knowledge is a huge weapon here. Why do you think Assange has been persecuted? Why do you think all of these whistleblowers have been persecuted to such a deranged and demented extent? It's because they expose the knowledge. So at the end of the day, that is the biggest weapon. Even if you can't do anything yourself to stop the inevitable, the destruction of the earth, you can educate people. You can further the awareness of what's actually going on. So, societally, there's a greater chance of people, revolting, uprising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the key takeaways of this book is understanding and reckoning with reality, not creating a delusion for yourself from hope, but standing firm on your principles and bringing the rest of the people around you with you, and waking them up, and being constructive and methodical and thoughtful about how you're doing those kinds of things is really important. But yeah, this was a damn good book club. This was our number 3. If you're curious and you liked this one, you can check out our Democracy Matters book club, which we did with our good friend Kamali Rose over at the Radical Democracy Show, book written by Cornel West, if you're not familiar with it. And then our very first book club was a series that we did breaking down Matt Taibbi's Hate Inc., which I was also really into. So go check that out if you're interested. But other than that, thanks for fucking listening, and we'll be back with another book club sometime in the near future.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate reading through this book. Hope you guys enjoyed as well, whether or not you read along. We really hope you appreciated and enjoyed this series, and it will continue. We might take a couple week hiatus, but we're going to be figuring out what text to do next. And we do like to offer these episodes early to our patron community. So not only will we be offering early access to the future book club episodes to our patron community, we're also going to try to make it a little more interactive this time. We're going to brainstorm a couple titles that we want to potentially do the next episodes about, and we're probably going to poll it for our patrons, let them decide what the next book will be. So, we'll come up with a couple of good titles that are relevant to the political moment that we really want to discuss. And then hopefully we'll let our patrons decide what our next book club will be. So again, we might like to make sure our community is engaged and involved with this series. It's something we really enjoy doing, even though it's obviously, maybe not getting as many views as some of our other content. I feel like it's just as important.